Well, for more, let's go now to our UK correspondent, Jonathan Sacerdoti. Jonathan, what is the latest there in London on this incident?
The cordon's just been moved back, Khaled, so we're standing much nearer to the tube station where this happened. But so far they've been keeping many of the details of the investigation close to their chest, which is always the way in these sorts of terror attacks. We do know a few things, though. One is that that improvised explosive device went off on the tube train, and that it was unlikely to have been the style of explosion that they had intended, perhaps only the primary explosion failing to detonate the rest of the device. It was a bucket with a bomb inside it and a timer attached to it, which is an important detail because it shows that it's not likely to have been a suicide bomber. With the police saying that they have identified a suspect on the CCTV, but they haven't named that suspect nor said whether or not he was known to them, we can be certain that there will be a manhunt going on still, and they'll be looking for that person to see if there's a chance of further attacks.
Well, Jonathan, stay with us, but first let's look at a timeline of recent terror attacks in London and the UK.
What I need you to do is move towards safety. Okay, safety is that way, thank you.
Well, as you can see, a wave of terror-related incidents in the UK. Let's go back to our Jonathan Sacerdoti. Jonathan, I understand you have a guest there to talk about these security issues.
I do, yes. I'm joined now by Tom Wilson, who's an expert in counter-terrorism and radicalisation. Tom can perhaps shed some light on what we do know so far. Tom, thanks very much for joining us on I-24. Tell me, are there any clues that we know now that have been released by eyewitnesses and the police as to who might have placed this device in the train?
Well, the fact that it was a remote device rather than a device that was set off by an individual who was looking to carry out a suicide attack obviously will lead to speculation about the ideological motive. It tends to be that far-right groups, groups related to the Northern Ireland conflict, anarchist groups in Southern Europe, they tend to use remote devices, whereas Islamist attackers, it's usually a suicide attack, and therefore the bomb maker or the person carrying the bomb wishes to be there when it detonates. However, in the UK, we have seen cases of Islamists using remote devices, such as in 2007 when there was a major attempted car bombing outside a nightclub here in London.
This, I think, is the fifth terror attack under Theresa May's premiership, and there has been some criticism of her for cutting of funding to the police. Do you think that that actually has played a part in this, or is that politicking over an unconnected terror attack?
It's difficult to imagine what a greater police presence could have done on the immediate aspect of this bomb exploding. What on earth extra police could have done to have prevented that from happening? It may be the case that perhaps more police working in counter-terrorism or at the community level perhaps could have disrupted this earlier on down the line. And I think increasingly the government will have to look more at preventative measures, counter-extremism work, and for that might not necessarily mean having more police, but it will mean more investment in the whole work of countering extremist ideology.
So in terms of preventative measures like that, especially if, as you suggest, this might not be an Islamist attack, what sorts of things should they be doing in order to prevent more attacks like this happening in the future?
Right, well, after the third of this year's attacks here in the UK at London Bridge, the Prime Minister said enough was enough. She said this country has been far too tolerant of extremism for too long. That means not legitimising the organisations that spread the ideology of extremism. It means engaging with individuals who we believe may be at risk of being drawn into radicalisation. investigation. And obviously here in Britain we do have what's called Prevent, which works for our public services to identify individuals at risk. But there's been a lot of opposition to it from teachers' unions, for instance, at universities. I think those people need to get on board with working to help the government strategy to function properly rather than opposing it.
Knowing that there is a manhunt underway still, very few details have been released, which of course is normal in these situations. Should the people of London in particular be worried about using the tube or about being in other public places where these sorts of attacks take place? Right,
I think that those concerns have been here in London anyway. Obviously when you know that there's a potential bomb maker at large, that is very frightening. But Londoners and people in the UK, as across Europe, have become increasingly used to living under the constant threat of terrorism. As the former head of MI5, Jonathan Evans, recently said, this is a generational problem. This is something that we could be looking at for several decades now. And it has been unrelenting, the wave of Islamist attacks, particularly as we've seen individuals obviously returning from Syria. We've seen a spike in that respect. And it seems that the entire threat level has shifted in that respect. And I think the public will be becoming increasingly impatient with what the authorities are going to do to rein this back in again. And finally, just in terms of preventative measures, security measures, what can be done in such a busy system like the London Underground, the Tube? Is there anything that can be done to stop somebody walking in with a bucket that looks like a painter's bucket and turns out to contain a large explosive? Sure. Well, one of the measures which is being talked about is, for instance, facial recognition CCTV cameras, that basically no human individual watching CCTV images can recognise all of the potential suspects. And given that there's something like 23,000 individuals in the UK who are of concern in terms of violent extremism, if an individual is known to the authorities, which often they have been recently, then a machine may be more likely to be able to use facial recognition technology to pick that person up. Well, thanks very much for joining us today, Tom. Obviously, plenty of food for thought there, and we know that the police, who you can see is still here in strong presence, will be continuing their investigations, looking potentially for the person that carried out this attack and trying to see if there are others which could be in preparation. So London is still very much a city looking for solutions to this terrorism problem. Back to you, Caleb.
Okay, thank you, Jonathan. And just to briefly recap,